A native of Wisconsin, Kurt Heinzelman lived for a number of years in Western Massachusetts. His work as a poet, scholar, and translator is widely published. He is also an editor, having co-founded 2 literary journals, the Poetry Miscellany and Bat City Review, and served as editor-in-chief of Texas Studies in Literature and Language. He lives in Austin, where he is a professor specializing in poetry and poetics at the University of Texas, and is a faculty member in the Michener Center for Writers. Please welcome Kurt Heinzelman.
Thanks. This store, which is, I think, one of the great assets of not only Austin, but of Texas and perhaps the Western Hemisphere, specializes only in small press publications, as you may have noticed, and all poetry and fiction. So no cookbooks, no travel books, no sports books. Right? It's just us. And it used to be a porn shop.
No kidding.
No kidding. No kidding. So there may still be a few vibes. I don't know.
Yeah. Small press one.
And
I saw the title "Sex and Rage."
Right over there. That's right. That's right. It's a holdover. Next door is a bar, and they've got the University of Texas football game on. So if you hear wild cheers, that's a good sign. I'm going to start with a poem that's about as personal as I ever write poem. And I'm reading it partly because my daughter is within a few weeks now of her 3rd child, gender unknown. So the characters in this poem there are 3 characters. Riker, who is the grandson, his mother, who is my daughter, and Riker's grandmother, whose family nickname is Amu, who is my wife. So the poem is called Riker's Reveille. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of having a 5-year-old wake you up in the morning, but that's what this one is about. Riker's Reveille. "Wake up," he said, "it's morning time." He went to ask his mother what time it was, sent by his mother's mother, Amu, who was in sleep time still. 10 to 8, he returned in no time. "Are you sure?" asked Amu, "that that's the time?" He went to ask his mother what that was again. What was, she asked. He said again what that time was. 10 past 8, she said. And that was what that time was, he said again, coming back to tell his Amu this time. Now I'm going to read a quartet of seasonal poems as we're here at the juncture of summer and fall and winter in Central Texas. Anything could happen, in other words. So this poem is from my new book called Whatever You May Say. And I had a book launch here just 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to keep my part of the evening quite small. This is called The Early Texas Spring. Only now in just February, when even if the wind stills, it still burns cheeks, the world is reinventing pavement again as parchment, and bird baths staying full tempt the slow sun to empty them. But can jasmine be blooming this soon? The empurpling of sage will come in a later, wiser flowering. Unseen gatherings of waxwings have imprinted walk and hood papyrus-like with pulpings of pyracantha. A lone robin hops toward a wall of scored limestone pointing north. Thickets of stickweed or witchgrass, or whatever we call it here, done with overrunning Bermuda and rye, now close around lacy fronds of wild carrot, choking stands of stiff bull thistle. Meanwhile, buried in slopes of lupine, waiting to flower, snakes are softening, skins tighten and sloughing down. Moving temporally along from the early spring to this poem called Fragility of Summer. Sometimes in July, when my front lawn is much greener than it is usually in July, I say, almost without thinking, how green my lawn is. The way at other times I might say, motherfucker, just to clear my palate, to wrap my mind around things, or the directions things take on those days when mint leaves turn blue beneath an emerald sky. This is a poem where the setting is not Texas, but the North. And it's called Fall Clearing Songs. I'm sorry, I'm overwhelmed by a vicious cocktail of allergens that are filling my respiratory system with sounds that I don't like to hear come out of me. So I apologize for my voice.
I don't hear it.
You don't hear it?
Well, I don't know how you normally sound well.
But I'll listen for it.
Inside me, I don't. Fall Clearing Songs. Now that we have turned the garden upside down, now that we have finished packing rose trees lengthways in the earth, our raising of the ground becomes the working in of ground, and all this fall becomes a sort of spring when, if we're together, we'll do it all again. A last run of the mower mulches leaves, my whistle chipping at the brittle air. Edging the white stones of the raised deck, I break wild runners from the blistered grapes, revealing the arbor vitae's delicate traceries of green. The flower beds are steeped in leaves, old annuals pulled out, the patio picked bone clean. Pressing down, we've worked the stubble in. I watch geese stroke against the clouds, their shadows under them. Out of it all, the sky falls, clear. I look around, you've suddenly gone in. Then seal exposures, caulk the sills, and kneel to fit the back storm door against its stops. How easily, inside, to see through each other's breath. And let me conclude with a winter poem. Which is that book. This poem will be more fun if you quickly remember everything you know about Wallace Stevens, the poet who wrote a number of aphorisms.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Adagia, yeah. The warmth of winter. My father owned a 40-acre farm, his family did, in southern Wisconsin. And the farm is on the rail line that one would have taken from Chicago to Minneapolis, St. Paul back in the day when the rail line went from Chicago through rural Wisconsin to Minneapolis, St. Paul. The warmth of winter. Wallace Stevens is on a train now in its foremost Pullman, taking him to St. Paul, that frozen river city, the one that one must cross the river of rivers to enter. He has just placed a round jar of bootleg back into his valise, picked up on the stopover in Chicago. This train will not be stopping tonight in Clinton or Shapir or anywhere else the rail lines have begun bypassing forever. And by the train has reached the area called Driftless, bypassed by glaciers. Wallace Stevens, surety attorney, will be asleep. In the roomy winter dusk, my father hasn't finished milking yet. The oil lamps swing in the crisp breeze passing through the cracks in the timbers and freshening the barn a bit. For electricity will not light this part of rural America for another decade. Another fact of life to check against its prologues to what is possible. My father has spent the last warmth of this winter afternoon in the spring house, mending tackle, because here the temperature is always like the early Wisconsin spring, and so his gloves are off as he makes the harness leather answer to the pull of stitch, the ebullience of lanolin that keeps the skin of his hands smooth and limber 75 years later, even when it's become parchment thin. He walks from milking now toward the house of darkened windows, past snowfields glowering around him like a stage set, backlit, as it were, by the faint overhead auroras. He is not yet afraid of global depression and war, genocide, renal failure, the real theater of the century he will live the fullness of. Perhaps he pictures a son listening after all the lights have failed to a train passing like the one whose horn my father has lifted his head just now to hear. Thank you so much.